Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History. As today, we talk about our second presidency, the presidency of John Adams. Now, the campaign for the election of 1796 was extremely dirty. Each side slandered the other with abandon. Still, Vice President John Adams was ultimately selected over Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson by a margin of 3 electoral votes, as depicted there. Jefferson, as the runner-up, would become vice president, and he would try to sabotage Adams' presidency, as would Alexander Hamilton, who, although a fellow Federalist, hoped to control the Adams administration and despised Adams for his independence. Adams would be no one's puppet. Adams, in turn, despised Hamilton for trying to control him. And others were angry as well. By the mid-1790s, the French were angry at the United States. They resented the Jay Treaty, which linked America economically with Britain, who was the enemy of the French Republic. They were angry, too, about Washington's Neutrality Proclamation of 1793, which very clearly ignored the alliance between France and America, which indeed Washington hoped to completely abandon, although technically the alliance continued. And so, the French began to raid American shipping on the high seas, violating America's freedom of the seas, a very important concept in American history. The idea that a neutral country, especially if it's us, should be able to trade with whomever they like and sail wherever they like, even if a war is going on amongst other countries. Again, this right to sail wherever we wish as a neutral country is one we will very carefully, very firmly defend, except for a few years in the mid-1930s. And indeed, as the French attacked our shipping, and the British sometimes did so as well, some Americans wanted war. Many were furious with the French, but Adams knew the United States could not do this. Our army was around 4,000 men. The French had well over 100,000 men in their army. So we couldn't do it militarily or economically. And so he sent a diplomatic mission composed of Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, Elbridge Gerry, and John Marshall to France. Pinckney and Gerry both being signers of the Declaration of Independence. John Marshall being an up-and-coming Virginia politician, but a Federalist, unlike many of his fellow Virginians. In France, they hoped to meet with Talleyrand, the French foreign minister, indeed one of the few great survivors of the French Revolution, having been involved in the Catholic Church before the Revolution, then switching to the revolutionary side during the Revolution, and then managing always to align with the winning faction in the repeated realignments of that bloody government, before siding with Napoleon as he rose to power, and then managing somehow to work for King Louis XVIII after the Revolution and Napoleonic Empire were fully put down. And our diplomats hoped to meet with him, but he refused to even meet with them directly, instead having to meet with 3 agents, codenamed X, Y, and Z. And before they would even arrange a meeting, they demanded a loan worth $10 million, which America could not possibly afford and would have violated Washington's Neutrality Proclamation. In addition to this loan, which likely would never have been repaid, they demanded an outright bribe of $250,000, which in those days was a lot of money. Furthermore, these bribes guaranteed nothing except the chance to talk to Talleyrand, did not guarantee any actual assistance from him. Now, bribes like this were not unusual in European politics and diplomacy, and our diplomats knew that. But the American public did not. When word got home, people were outraged. Any hope for peace died. And as our diplomats refused to pay the bribe, they became national heroes. The slogan of the day was "Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute." And fearing war was coming, the United States created the Department of the Navy, creating another position in the U.S. cabinet, the Navy and War Departments being fully separate until merged into the Defense Department in 1947. The first Secretary of the Navy would be Benjamin Stoddert, and he began to oversee the construction of a navy, which was vital because the United States had sold off all our warships when the Revolutionary War ended, aside from a very small Coast Guard meant to catch smugglers. So we began building several frigates, but even our best ships, and there were very few of those, would have been in the British classification system, have been fourth-rate ships. The British having 3 classes of ships better than the best ships we hoped to build. We also reestablished the United States Marine Corps. During the Revolutionary War, the Continental Marines had served with the Navy, but were disbanded when the war came to an end. And Congress authorized a 10,000-man army, and to lead it, we planned to call from retirement George Washington to save his country once more. And the plan, if necessary, was to invade France. Although, had we actually done that, the invasion was to be led by Alexander Hamilton. Washington would have been largely a figurehead for our army at this point. And so, the American and French navies began an undeclared war on the high seas. Because it was not formally declared, but certainly resulted in death and destruction, it was called the Quasi-War. Quasi meaning kind of, or sort of. It was sort of a war. And while there's no official start to the war, it's generally considered to have begun in 1798, when Congress revoked some minor treaties between the U.S. and France. All the official big Franco-American alliance remained. The U.S. did capture about 80 French ships, but may have lost as many as 2,000 of our merchant ships. Again, most of this war was about trying to capture the enemy's merchant ships, not so much a direct confrontation between the U.S. Navy and the French Navy. But the Quasi-War did not develop into a real war. There was no invasion of France, nor a French invasion of the United States, because although many Americans, led by the high Federalists like Alexander Hamilton, really wanted a war, it was very popular, at least in theory. The fact was, both Adams and Talleyrand did not want a war. And Adams didn't think we could win this, and I think he was right. Talleyrand had his hands full dealing with all of France's other engagements in Europe, and he with Napoleon's recent seizure of power and his growing ambition. So here, as elsewhere, Adams showed that his integrity came first. He did the right thing as he understood it, correctly in this case, I think, even though it made him very unpopular. The people wanted war, and he told them no. This cost him the next election, and arguably cost the Federalists in general a large measure of their power. Diplomats returned to France, and in the Convention of 1800 brought an end to the Quasi-War, and also officially ended the old Franco-American alliance, and each side agreed to pay for their own losses. So American merchants who lost their property in the war were to be reimbursed by the U.S. government. But as the Quasi-War was being fought with a lot of public support, but a lot of criticism from the Jeffersonian Republicans, Federalists, who still controlled Congress as well as the presidency, passed a series of 4 laws known as the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. 3 of those 4 laws were the Alien Acts, which increased the residency requirement to become a U.S. citizen from 5 years to 14 years, because when immigrants became citizens, they tended to vote for the Republicans. In part, many were poor, many were farmers who moved to the West, and as small farmers, they felt that the Democratic Republicans' policies favored them. Indeed, in general, Federalists distrusted the West, feeling that Western settlement threatened to pull people away from the central authority that they preferred. And again, small farmers tended to vote for Jefferson's Republicans. So this made it harder to become a citizen. You had to wait 14 years rather than 5 before asking. Although once you applied for citizenship, it was almost always granted. Furthermore, the president could deport dangerous foreigners at any time or imprison them during wartime. And although this was not actually done at the time, it frightened many foreigners into leaving the country and gave the president, on paper at least, a great deal of power, perhaps too much. And while it wasn't really used at this point, the Alien Enemies Act, which was one of the Alien Acts, was later used to justify expelling Confederate sympathizers from the North during the Civil War. During World War II, it was just used in part to justify the internment of Japanese Americans, even those who were American citizens. And quite recently, it has been part of the legal basis for banning visitors from predominantly Muslim countries during our war on terror. And as passed by the Federalists in 1798. Now, the Sedition Act was directed against anyone guilty of sedition, which means working to undermine your own government. And sedition here was classified as impeding the government's policies or falsely defaming its officials, freedom of speech or not. Such seditious persons could be fined or imprisoned. But because the power to do this rested with the Federalist-controlled government, those who were fined or imprisoned were entirely Jeffersonians, predominantly newspaper editors, who printed unpleasant stories about the Adams administration. 10 men were tried, all were convicted. Matthew Lyon was the most famous of these. He was incidentally nicknamed the Spitting Lion because he had once spit in the face of a Federalist. He was locked up for 4 months because he had described Adams as having an unbounded thirst for ridiculous pomp, foolish adulation, and selfish avarice. Imagine saying such a thing about the president. Another newspaper man was fined $100, in those days a lot of money, for wishing that a cannon that had been fired in Adams' honor had in fact hit him in the butt. And when this reached the Supreme Court, which was also dominated by Federalists, they backed up the acts. Although the Alien and Sedition Acts had been written so that most would expire in 1801, so just in case the Federalists weren't reelected, the laws would not automatically apply to them. A wise choice, it turns out, for the Federalists. But overall, the Alien and Sedition Acts initially had widespread popular support. In 1798, 1799, Americans were in a frenzy over the Quasi-War and felt such laws were necessary to keep the country safe from French influence, keep us strong in the fight against the French. But there certainly were those unhappy with them, particularly Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And so the two of them anonymously wrote resolutions introduced by the governments, the legislatures of Kentucky and Virginia. And the Virginia Resolution and the Kentucky Resolution. And the Kentucky Resolution produced by Jefferson, the Virginia Resolution by Madison, and which was slightly less extreme, both put forth in those state legislatures the doctrine of nullification. The idea that if a law is unconstitutional, state governments may declare it to be unconstitutional and refuse to enforce it within their borders. And if a state legislature feels a law is unconstitutional, they may declare it to be null, to be nothing, and not enforce it within their own boundaries. The Federalists obviously disagreed, saying that if anyone had the right to declare a law unconstitutional, it was not the states. The Supremacy Clause seems to make federal law supreme over state laws, even state constitutions. If anyone can declare a law unconstitutional, that should be the Supreme Court. An idea known as judicial review. Again, the idea that the Supreme Court may declare a law to be unconstitutional, an idea that was developing in legal practice at the time, although in fact, the principle of judicial review is not mentioned anywhere in the Constitution. Arguably, the power to declare a law unconstitutional is unconstitutional. Now, In 1800, Adams ran for re-election, or rather, he stood for re-election, which is what you were said to do in those days. To run for re-election would be undignified. Indeed, to campaign for yourself would be undignified. You let it be known that reluctantly you would accept the nomination for the presidency if people really wanted you to do it, but to actually campaign would seem too much like begging. Other people campaigned for you. You at most might give speeches from your house or write the occasional letter or something along those lines. No major candidate for the presidency would actively campaign on his own behalf until 1896, and he will lose to a man who gave speeches from his front porch. Adams, of course, was opposed by his own vice president, Thomas Jefferson. But the Republicans had worked out that having one man get the presidency and the second place man and from the opposing party get the vice presidency wasn't that great a deal. And so they had two candidates, the other being Aaron Burr. The notion being that they would come in first and second for the presidency, and thus Burr would become vice president. The Federalists kind of had a similar idea, and also had Charles Cotesworth Pinckney as a candidate. Indeed, there were some other candidates as well. The two-party system was not really that well organized. And the first two-party system is pretty different from the ones that will come along later. Adams, of course, was attacked by Jefferson and also by Alexander Hamilton, who should have been his ally, but again had a personal grudge and some policy disagreements against Adams. Hamilton by now was out of office, but still very influential in the Federalist Party, especially in his home state of New York. Adams, of course, fought back, especially against Jefferson. Federalists had problems. Of course, the split between Adams and Hamilton and their respective followers was a serious problem. The kind of anticlimactic conclusion to the Quasi-War had disappointed many people for whom a war had seemed like an exciting prospect. But even if there had not been an official war, there was an official debt, especially due to the creation of a navy with 6 state-of-the-art frigates. Indeed, there was an attempt to pay for it through a federal property tax, the only time that was ever tried in U.S. history. To fight back against the Jeffersonians, the Federalists began a campaign of rumors, claiming that Jefferson had once robbed an old widow of her trust fund, which I think is untrue, that he had fathered numerous mulatto children, mixed-race children, which DNA evidence now shows was definitely true. At the very least, he had a number with his slave, Sally Hemings, who was said to closely resemble his dead wife. Indeed, was quite possibly her half-sister, having originally come from his wife's father's plantation. It was said he was an atheist, which was not entirely true, but was not entirely false. He was a deist and believed in God, but did not believe in miracles, believed Jesus Christ had been a great teacher, but probably not the Son of God, had certainly not risen from the dead. He had his own Bible, which he had heavily edited, removing the parts that he felt were unrealistic, making a slimmer volume, to be sure. Indeed, people were so frightened, many buried their family Bibles out of fear that Jefferson, if he became president, would confiscate them and burn them. Still, Adams came in third, with 65 votes in the election of 1800, whereas Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson, the Republican candidates, tied with 73. And because they tied, that meant that neither had a majority. And so the decision was made not in the Electoral College, but in the House of Representatives, with each state getting a single vote. And it was not certain which way it would go. The plan had been for Burr to become vice president, but now that he saw a chance for the presidency, he started working toward it. And in the end, the decision would be made in large part due to the influence of Alexander Hamilton, who deeply disagreed with Jefferson, did not like him, did not want to see him be president, but he felt that Burr was far worse. And Jefferson, at least, he thought was relatively sane. Burr, a fellow New Yorker, he saw as a personal enemy, a political enemy, even an enemy in business, a man he entirely distrusted. And so Hamilton used his influence in the Federalist Party to convince Federalists, who couldn't possibly choose their own man, to pick the lesser of two evils, Thomas Jefferson. But it was felt that this was not a system that ought to continue. And also, of course, a situation like John Adams, where the president had to face a vice president who was his rival rather than an assistant. And so the 12th Amendment was created in 1803, ratified in 1804, declaring that in the future, the 2 votes cast by each presidential elector would be cast separately and specifically, one for the president and one for the vice president, although with the condition that you could not cast both votes for a man from your own state. Still, while Adams was on his way out of office, he did have some time to do a few important things, most notably appointing a number of judges to federal positions. And the accusation would be made that he stayed up till midnight, his last night in office, appointing these federal judges, so that his opponents called them the midnight judges. This was not entirely true, but not entirely false. Of these midnight judges, by far the most important would be John Marshall, who would remain on the Supreme Court as Chief Justice from 1801 until his death in 1835, and continue the policies of the Federalist Party long after the Federalist Party itself had vanished. And the Federalists, despite their errors, did have a number of important accomplishments. They built a solid financial base for the country. They kept us out of war with Britain, or France, or Spain, giving us a little breathing space before undertaking any major projects. Unfortunately for them, from a political point of view, the benefits of their good works, careful governance, were actually enjoyed politically by Thomas Jefferson and the Republican leaders who followed him. It's been said by some, Jefferson kept the Federalist edifice while ousting the Federalist architect. While the Federalists might be on their way out, many of their policies remain.